So, let's talk about one of the most famous economic projects in history, the Marshall Plan. But, this isn't just a dry story about money and rebuilding. Nope. This is a story about a massive Cold War chess game and a really surprising, almost hidden story about one small nation that turned a simple loan into an incredible statement of national honor.
And that's a question I really want you to hang on to as we go through this. Can a debt actually be a declaration of sovereignty? Because while pretty much every country saw the Marshall Plan as a much-needed lifeline, one nation saw it as something totally different, something that was all about honor.
All right, so to really get why the Marshall Plan was such a game changer, we have to rewind. We have to picture what Europe looked like right after World War II. I mean, it's hard to even imagine. The devastation was just everywhere. Industries, gone. Entire cities were just piles of rubble. Millions of people were homeless and starving. This wasn't just a humanitarian crisis. It created this huge power vacuum. And into that vacuum, a brand new kind of conflict started to bubble up.
And that new reality? The Cold War. The United States, led by President Truman, decided on a policy of containment. The simple goal was to stop the Soviet Union's influence from spreading any further. And the Americans had a very specific idea about what kind of environment communism loved the most.
Yeah, the thinking in the US was that communism was kind of like a virus that spread best in places suffering from poverty and despair. So their solution wasn't just about military might, it was about economics.
So that's where the Marshall Plan comes in, or as it was officially called, the European Recovery Program. Now, on the surface, it looked like an unbelievably generous act of humanitarian aid. But just beneath the surface, it was an absolutely brilliant strategic move. By rebuilding Western Europe, the US could create a bunch of stable, wealthy, capitalist allies who would serve as a powerful wall against the Soviet Union.
But hey, this money wasn't just a free-for-all. You see, this aid came with some serious strings attached. Countries had to promise to work together, to get their own financial houses in order, and, this is a big one, they had to spend the money on American goods. So not only did it rebuild Europe, but it also gave the American economy a massive boost and tied Western Europe together into one big economic team.
Now, you can probably guess that the Soviet Union was, well, let's just say they were not big fans of this plan. They saw it for exactly what it was, a clever play to pull all of Europe into America's corner, and they weren't about to just sit back and watch.
From Moscow's point of view, this was just dollar imperialism. They saw it as the US just using its cash to buy friends and influence. They flat out banned any of their satellite states in Eastern Europe from taking any American money and scrambled to launch a rival plan of their own.
And just like that, the new economic map of Europe was drawn. On one side, you had the OEC countries, the group handling the Marshall Plan aid, all tied to the United States. And on the other, you had Comecon, Moscow's answer, which integrated all the Eastern Bloc economies under the Kremlin's control. The economic Iron Curtain had officially fallen.
Okay, so with that big picture in mind, I want to zoom in on one country's story because it just completely breaks the mold. Let's talk about Portugal.
You see, unlike places like France or the UK, Portugal hadn't been wrecked by the war. So why join? Well, for them, it was a strategic move. The government wanted to make sure it had a seat at the big kids' table in this new European order. For Portugal, this wasn't about needing a bailout, not at all. It was about political positioning.
And you can see that right here in the numbers. While big players like the UK and France were getting billions, if you squint and look really closely, you can see Portugal's share is barely a blip. And this next chart really drives that point home.
I mean, just look at this. It's wild. The United Kingdom gets over $2.8 billion. France, almost $2.5 billion. And then, all the way down at the end, there's Portugal, with a mere $51 million. It's practically a rounding error in comparison. It just proves that for them, this was never really about the cash. And if you break that down per person, it gets even crazier, just under $6 a head. To put that in perspective, every person in Austria got over $80. People in Iceland got over $160. So the key takeaway here is that Portugal was in the club, but they weren't really cashing in. And that's what makes what they did next so surprising.
So years go by. The Marshall Plan is a huge success, and Western Europe is back on its feet. For pretty much every other country, that aid money was treated like a grant, a gift, but not for Portugal.
Then, out of the blue, in 1962, 14 years after the whole thing started, the Portuguese government does something that just completely blindsides Washington. A check for $3 million shows up at the Portuguese embassy. The instructions? Deliver it to the U.S. State Department. It was the first payment on their Marshall Plan loan. The American officials were just scratching their heads. They were like, wait, what is this? No other country was trying to pay the money back. They literally had no process, no paperwork for accepting a payment. The American diplomats even suggested, hey, why don't you guys just hang on to this check for a while? But the reply from Lisbon was fast and it was firm. It translates to, pay now and demand a receipt. This wasn't a suggestion, it was an order.
And this quote really gets to the heart of why they did it. A Portuguese official later asked the Director General of Public Accounting why on earth they were insisting on paying a debt nobody else was. This was the answer. For the leaders of Portugal, this had nothing to do with economics. It was about pride. It was about sovereignty and respect. It was a powerful declaration that they stood on their own 2 feet.
So, what are we supposed to take away from all this? What's the real legacy here?
Look, there's no denying the Marshall Plan worked. It was a massive success, both in rebuilding economies and in its geopolitical goals. It literally shaped the world we're living in right now. But this little story, this Portuguese footnote, it adds such a fascinating and different layer to the whole history.
It leaves us with a really big question, one that goes way beyond this single historical event. We tend to measure a country's power by its economy or its military. But Portugal's story hints at another kind of power, the power that comes from not being in anyone's debt. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the biggest statement a country can make isn't with bombs or banks, but with a simple check and a demand for a receipt.